Praise God. Okay, last time we were looking at the topic of the conspiracy of American public education, and I was describing to you, first of all, after we had distanced ourselves from the homeschooling movement, I was describing to you how that conspiracy works, And in distancing ourselves from the homeschooling movement, we were trying to emphasize that it is as much, if not more, and it certainly is more, of a satanic conspiracy than it is a human one. And the first thing that I gave you under how the conspiracy works was this. I said that they feed you a pack of lies of fear, telling you that you can't do it, you don't have enough time, you don't have the right resources, you're not intellectually capable, you're too biased in your own views, you're unqualified, you're inept, etc. And then we gave some arguments against that. Basically, the fact that that is clearly to protect their own vested interests, that they would have us feel this way about ourselves. So that's one way how the conspiracy works. There's one thing that the public educators as a whole, now you'll always find exceptions. You can find, friends, public school teachers who think that it's just wonderful and ideal that you teach your children at home. But that's the exception, though. They couldn't all feel that way. Or they'd be encouraging all their pupils to, get your mom and dad to teach you at home. Then they'd be talking themselves out of a job. So let's just face the facts and use some common sense and be realistic here. On the whole, the public school system and the teachers are very opposed, not only to homeschooling, but to any alternative to public education, including private schools. They're very opposed to that. They simply do not want that. And what they are after, some of them more consciously than others, is this conspiracy of feeding you a pack of lies to keep you off the track. And another way we want to get into this morning, in fact, the way in which that conspiracy works is by here not feeding you a pack of lies, but a bunch of myths that I call Blumenfeld's myths. He's a social scientist and an educational writer, and I think he's very perceptive in this regard when it comes to the mythology of public education. Now, what I find, as we're going to look at a series of a half a dozen or so myths, and all of them built on one chief myth, what I find so interesting is that the modern, skeptical, secular, rationalistic system out there is so opposed, generally speaking, to what we call myths. I mean, that's what they call the Bible, and say, well, the reason we don't believe that is because it's filled with a bunch of myths in there. The myth of the resurrection, the myth of the crossing of the Red Sea, and this myth and that myth. And what we'll see, however, is they are very deeply involved in the subject of mythology. Maybe not ancient mythology, just current mythology. And they have surrounded themselves with a very neat system of democratic, good old, dyed-in-the-wool American myths. And they, as we would used to say, would do the snow job on people as a result of that. So here are those myths. Number one, you might want to write down what you can of these myths. The first myth, Blumenfeld's myth, is this. Public education, this is the myth, is a great democratic institution fundamental to America's prosperity and well-being. I mean, you kind of know that's the ethos of your climate, of your environment. I hope there are enough of us here in the church that came up the good old American way of public education and teacher and your little science fair projects and homecoming and basketball games and all of this, so that we know what it's all about. It's a very real, almost spiritual experience you go through. It really is, just to get to go to school. Just the whole thing, I mean, well, we'll get into that later. Public education is a great democratic institution fundamental to America's prosperity and well-being. Almost everyone in this country believes that public education is fundamental to our prosperity and to our greatness as a nation. It's fundamental to that. However, a study of history will show that we were more literate. This nation was more literate before the laws of compulsory education were ever enacted than we are today. We've been fed these myths, these lies about, how back in those days before education, all these pioneers, they just chewed tobacco and killed Indians and got their own heads scalped, and they were a bunch of ignoramuses. And if you do a little study of history, you'd be surprised that so many of those people were very educated people, but they didn't go to school to get it. Yeah. But they were very knowledgeable. If you ask, well, how do you get knowledgeable if you don't go to school and you don't read? And well, there are other ways. The ways that other societies educate their people, they don't pack them up and send them off to some institution somewhere. There's a way that you can educate the people in your society so they can function in your society. But the way to do that is not to pack them up and send them off. So I'm getting ahead of myself, so you'll think ahead of me. Well, what is the way then? There is an alternative to all of this nonsense. But you see, these myths, with these, we've been force-fed this idea of the glories of American public education. So much better than any of the other countries have. We should be so grateful for it, that we are a literate society, that we can read and write. And as I've said already before, you'd be surprised the number of people who come out of public education who still can't read or write. If that were the answer, then that's the answer. And those people say, well, it's not the system's fault, it's those students who didn't want to learn. Well, that's part of it, but you haven't given us the whole answer. Part of that is in the system itself. The system itself is made in such a way it can't help people like that. It simply can't. It's not designed to help people like that. So the system, at least on that count, on that score, is a failure. But we've been force-fed this idea of the glories of American public education. And you just have to, like the glories of medical science, do a little study and work your way through it with some common sense, and you'll see what a myth you've been told all your life. Secondly, another myth: public education produces the best possible education because we are the best possible country spending the most possible money. Well, I'm sure they're right on that last point there. We're pouring a lot of money down the drain to, quote, educate, unquote, some basketball goons that come out of school not knowing how to do anything but initial a basketball. It provides the best possible education because we are the best possible country spending the most possible money. You think of these things. These are myths. This was a part of your personality. You just thought this way. You never challenged these thoughts. We all were like this at one time or the other. We are the best possible country that there is. We're spending the most possible money. 2 and 2 is 4. It's only logical. We're going to get the best possible results. And the best system for all this to be seen in is called public education. But we can go back to challenge, the first thing here, the best possible country. On whose standard? By what criteria are we the best possible? You say, well, I don't know what you would say. There are so many things you could say. The strongest, we're not that. If we've ever been, we're certainly not anymore, militarily speaking. The brightest, that's not necessarily true either. The most, we're going to get to what it really is where people end up here in a moment. It is a deception of the first order. A third myth of public education. Public education is necessary as the great equalizer in our society. It's the great equalizer in our, it is a system through which we all have to pass, with a few exceptions of homeschoolers and private schoolers. I mean, their numbers pale compared to the majority of students that go through public education. It's necessary as the great equalizer in our society. It functions as the great equalizer in our society, bringing together children from different ethnic, social, racial, and religious groups, and molding them into the ideal homogenized American. Bringing together children from different ethnic, social, racial, and religious groups. See, that's part of our creed in this country. Well, it's an interesting creed. Now, because of some law, you'll find down at the bottom of employment notice that this is an equal opportunity. We don't discriminate, and they'll list the whole things: race, religion, handicap, sex, the whole thing. And the list is getting longer and longer. Pretty soon you're going to say, we don't discriminate against those who discriminate. You got to go on and on. They're adding things on there. It used to be just race, or sex, and then race. And then now it's handicap today. Handicaps, after the sex thing with woman suffrage and the right to vote back at the turn of the century, and then the Negro movement in the 50s and 60s, now it's the handicapped people. And it's becoming now the perverts, the homosexuals now. It's the perverts, that we cannot discriminate on the basis of sexual preferences. And it'll just be one thing after another thing after another thing, where there's no end to things like this. We don't discriminate against the communists. I mean, if you want to be faithful to your own credo, you have to say that. Now, we can't, they'd overrun our country, but hey, if they're a communist, that's fair. And if the majority are communists in this country, then we deserve a communist leader. People wouldn't really want that, but that's where your creed will lead you to eventually, though. So I think we've gone from women, this great equalizer, from women to the racists, to the handicapped, now to the sex perverts. And there's no way that if you choose to be a homosexual, that's your own choice. That's your own private choice. You have the freedom of that. And can someone bar you from teaching in the public school for being a pervert in your own private time? You see, this American mentality is we can separate these different components of our life. And that carried over into religion. That you could separate Sunday from Monday through Saturday, and you cannot do that as a human being. You are a whole human being, and you're the whole you, the all you, and nothing but the you all the time. You may choose to let some little shades shine forth more clearly on one occasion versus another, but the you is still there. There's no way you can separate between what a man does in his private time and what he does in public office, as it were, or elected a school board member or something. And there's a lot of connection between what you do in your private time and what you do in your public life. Amen. And molding them into the ideal, homogenized American. Now he's this kind of fuzzy, gooey-looking thing. He's neither left nor right, neither white nor black, neither red nor yellow. He's kind of this fuzzy thing that's hard to really get your hands on. He can't say that he believes anything because that'd be dogmatism. Of course, I've already shown you in early teachers that is dogmatism. Your dogmatism is you can't believe in dogmatism, and you're dogmatic about it. But they haven't thought that far. But you can't. It's this fuzzy, gray, hazy, multi-headed, multi-personality type thing that we prided ourselves on. You see, we've said we don't discriminate against this, that, and the other, and then we're also believing, however, and they're contradictory ideologies, we believe, on the other hand, that we're a great melting pot. That we are a great melting pot. Well, a melting pot needs to blend them into this homogenized ideal American, but to do that, you have to discriminate against anything that disagrees with that. The blacks and the Puerto Ricans and whomever, they want to have their own ethnic subculture. They want that. There are these laws that they're wrestling with out in California now and in the southern states like Texas and especially in places like San Antonio. Are they going to print signs in Spanish? When about half, if not more, of the population is Spanish. But yet, wait a minute, we're Americans and we should, are you going to discriminate against them? You see, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to say we're a great melting pot. So we have to go toward one goal, and that goal is this ideal, homogenized, whatever you want to say, American. But on the other hand, we say we don't discriminate on the basis of race, sex, which means language, which means your culture, your ethnic background. And you better believe there are hundreds of things built into this country that discriminate. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just showing you the mess, the confusion in it all. If I were to have my say or way, I think that the only thing where you're going to end up with consistency at the end of the day is to discriminate and say this is what we're after if you want to be an American. Now, if you don't want to be this, that's okay. We're going to love you anyway. We're going to ship you out, though. We're going to ship you to the place where people live like that. Yeah. That's the only way you can function. That's right. You've got this mass confusion on your hands. That doesn't mean you would dislike the Mexicans, but if they want to speak Spanish, they've got to go where the Spanish live. They don't live in America. We are English people here. We speak English. You saw probably the article of the controversy going on in Canada, where they're going to print the signs in French or in English. Yeah. Well, they were founded by the French. But you see, they're so close to one of the world's superpowers with the super international universal tongue, English, that it's a real toss-up what you're supposed to do. Those are French people up there. Let them speak their own mother tongue. They came from France. We didn't. We came from England. So if I had my say, I think that the so-called, I wouldn't say a homogenized American, I would have some other way of describing it, but the only way you'll ever reach that, what I'm saying, is if that is our goal, the only way you'll reach that is to discriminate. You have to. You've got to rule out anything and force it out that doesn't blend in with whatever your ideal is. Somehow they have their cake and they're eating it too. They're wanting both of these things. Now, under this, what are we on, the third myth? Included in that myth is another sub-myth, and that is that public education is ideologically neutral. Is ideologically neutral. And it preaches no religious doctrine. Now, you see, for years, public education in this country was greatly influenced by the so-called Judeo-Christian heritage. And so there were Christian themes and Christian holidays celebrated and Christian this and Christian that. And there was prayer in school and the Bible was read and devotions were had in public schools. The name of God was invoked over the children. Well, due to a lot of very interesting and very recent developments in this country, the public educators finally saw that, wait a minute, this is actually contrary to what we say our creed is. They're not supposed to be supporting some religion. We don't let the Muslims come in here. We don't read out of the Quran every morning. They finally got smart enough to see that we're embarking on a never, never, no land. Because all a Muslim has to do is take us to court and say, now, if you're going to read the Bible, you have to read the Quran. And then the Mormons would take you to court and say, and also after that devotion, you have to give from the Book of Mormon a devotion. And then every Tom, Dick, and Harry can bring his own little litany, his little creedal book, and say, now, you got to have this. I don't belong to a religion. I am my own religion. But I'm a religion, and it's important to me, and it's meaningful. Well, you know, you take up, what, all 24 hours of the day saying the devotions in the morning to meet all the religious groups. So they said, we're going to get rid of Christianity, get that out, because public education is ideologically neutral. Ideologically neutral. Well, of course, that's an absolute impossibility. That's an absolute impossibility. In the first place, they are teaching a religion, and that's the religion that there's no religion. That is your religion then. Ideologically neutral, your ideology is anti-supernatural, anti-God, anti-Christ. You do have an ideology that you follow. Because they don't put a name tag on it like Christianity or Roman Catholicism or Protestantism. They think they're free from that charge of being ideologically or religiously biased. But in fact, no one can escape that. Even the heathen can't escape that. His philosophy is there is no God, and he's a heathen. And he preaches that doctrine to others. Well, we've gone over that a lot in pluralism, our tapes on pluralism and Christian ethics earlier. All right, let's come to a fourth myth. That is, the neighborhood school, with its cadre of dedicated teachers and administrators, belongs to the community and is answerable to the community through an elected school board. Another myth of public education, myth number 4. This is how the conspiracy works, by propagating lies and myths. So, and you rarely will hear, well, I can't say rarely. If you get in on a patriotic service during the month of July in this country, you'll hear all types of the most nonsensical, absurd statements made about all types of things about God and country and motherhood and apple pie. The neighborhood school, with its cadre of dedicated teachers and administrators, belongs to the community and is answerable to it through an elected school board. That is nowhere even near the truth. As we'll see, the public school is so insulated. It gets its marching orders from a national organization. The national organization is influenced by education departments in far-flung colleges and universities where philosophies and ideologies are dreamed up. Those are the people who write the textbooks, and those are the people who influence the school and to whom they are accountable. But this business of being elected, that always sounds good to the American public. They don't like appointed. But elected, that's good. If we elected, we can unelect then. If we hired, we can fire. Someone just got appointed, well, that's unusual. That's why things like the Supreme Court is very unusual in America. There was no reason why they did that. Those men aren't elected. You don't vote those men or vote those men out, in or out. They're there for life. They're appointed by one man. He's got to have approval of the Congress, the Senate, but one man, and they're there for life. That's unusual to ever find that in America. We don't elect, no one else comes into any high office that way. No one else, not even the president. Just those men, 9 old men, 8 now and 1 woman, and a couple of them are middle-aged. Fifthly, our society, the final myth, our society cannot live without public education. That's kind of the end of all of that. Our society cannot live without public education. Now, all of these myths, then, are built upon one final myth. One final myth, we could call her the myth of Lady Liberty. Many people have gotten misty eyes as they sailed into New York's harbor. I've never experienced that. I guess it could be a real experience if you come out of some totalitarian, repressive regime, but you're only exchanging. This is very hard for an American to accept. You're only exchanging one set or one type of evils for another set. Amen. That's all you're exchanging. Am I in favor of people being butchered by their dictators? No, I'm not in favor of that. God will judge those dictators for butchering their own people. But it's a myth that you now have left evil behind and you found good. You've exchanged one type of evil for another type of evil. And someone else's scale may rank the evil in this country higher than the evil in another country. I have to rank it higher in some regards. It's a more subtle, it's a more destructive type evil. You don't know what you're fighting in this country. At least in another country, you know what you're fighting. You're fighting your own leader. He's out to kill you. You're fighting your friends who are informers to the secret police. You know what you're fighting. You know what's going on. It's all black and white in a lot of countries. It's not black and white in this country, and that's the one thing we pride ourselves in, that it's not black or white. You're fighting a much more difficult enemy here, and if you don't know who your enemy is, you're never going to get him. You're never going to overcome him. So much for misty, warm eyes that have sailed into New York's harbor and seen the Statue of Liberty. I praise God that they got out of a place that was going to kill them. But they come out of the furnace into an oven, though. You've exchanged one set of evils, one type of evil, for another type here that few people are knowledgeable about at all. But all of this rests on the underlying myth of Lady Liberty, and that goes like this. See if this doesn't sound like good, 8th grade civics class. All men are created equal. All men are created equal. We're going to analyze that to begin with, because that's really what undergirds all of public education as well as American society. And it's a myth in itself, as long as a summer day is. All men are created equal, and government, as the great equalizer, is the most benevolent dispenser of human goodness, generosity, and justice on earth. We mean the American government. All men are created equal. And the government, as the greatest or the great equalizer, is the most benevolent dispenser of human goodness, generosity, and justice on earth. Now, it's this type of horribly contradictory and false mentality, not to say totally unworkable, that has been the source for most of our problems in this country. Religious problems, pluralism now, all of the social agencies and social programs and Medicaid, Medicare, and food stamps, and all of this stuff owes itself to this one myth that I'm describing to you right now by definition. It all owes itself to that. You don't find a lot of the things you find here in this country and others. It's because you don't find this myth in other countries. All men are created equal. Most countries don't believe that. They know the facts tell us otherwise. But all men are created equal, and government, as the great equalizer, is the most benevolent dispenser of human goodness, generosity, and justice on earth. If you go back up to, I think it was the third myth that I gave you earlier, public education is necessary as the great equalizer. in our society, bringing together children from different ethnic, social, racial, and religious groups and molding them into homogenized Americans. That is really the myth that owes itself so much to this underlying, undergirding lady liberty myth that I'm describing to you now. All men are created equal, and the government is the best thing because it's the most capable thing to govern their life, to hand out good things and to hand out rewards and to hand out punishment as well. If you open your Bible to the book of Galatians, I think I will just start by introducing you to what I want to say with a few biblical references. And then we're going to look over in Deuteronomy chapter 15, and there are many other places where we'll be looking at the topic of the poor financially, the socially poor, the financially poor. Our society, because it was founded on this incredible myth, it was just a wish, a dream of founding fathers, friends, who came over and founded this country after they left some of the tyranny of King George in England. And you just exchanged one form of tyranny for another form. That's all you did. Whether it's the tyranny of a king or it's the tyranny of false myths and philosophies that rule people's lives with an iron will and scepter, you've simply exchanged one form of oppression and suppression for another one. Our society, does it not, holds that all men are created equal, therefore all men should be treated the same way, and all men deserve the same things. And we have seen with legislation in this country in this century, with the examples I gave you earlier, it started back with the women, and it's gone through the races, now to the sexual perverts, that everyone deserves their fair shot in life. Everyone is equal, basically equal. The people who run this government now have the old Enlightenment philosophy of man that he's basically good. And if you would give him the right incentive or right motives or give him some resources or give him some help, he'll turn out the way you expect him to, which is good because he inherently is good. Or what is the proposed amendment to the Constitution concerning the women call but the Equal Rights Amendment? The Equal Rights Amendment. Whether it's right or wrong, right now is beside the point. It's caused the country no end of problems. No end of problems. You've just opened Pandora's box when you try to change the traditional culture and the way things traditionally have been done. You're opening something that you're going to wish you never would have opened one day. If you were just doing a little study, a little knowledgeable of some of these things going on in the workplace now, we have created havoc in the workplace now by allowing and encouraging women to work and giving them all of these rights. And
Amen.
You know, an employer, he's almost bound to hire anybody who comes now, because if he doesn't hire you, all you got to do is go out and sue and say, well, he didn't like the way I looked, or he didn't like me because I was a woman, or because I was an ethnic, or because I slurred some of my words, or you can sue someone for almost anything now. What, for discrimination? You get in a lot of trouble in the workforce and field for discrimination. There was a Christian group in Minneapolis here not that long ago that was taken to court. It's a Christian group owned, founded by Christians, and they will not hire unbelievers to work for them.
Hallelujah.
The government says, no, you cannot be a public, in the public domain type of corporation and deny equal access to the payroll here. You cannot do that in this country. That is discrimination in itself. You're discriminating against Christians who are trying to follow biblical principles. And yet everything is supposed to be in the name of, well, let's make sure that we rule out discrimination. That is discrimination. It's kind of like what we've studied. This morning will sound a little like what we've said on tape before concerning pluralism. Because you might be asking, all right, well then how do you get rid of discrimination? You don't. It's impossible.
Amen.
It's totally impossible. It's just that you're going to exchange one way to discriminate for another way. That's all you're going to do. You cannot get rid of discrimination. Except for these people who are the higher ups, though, who tell us how we can manifest our discrimination. And you can manifest it now against Christians who don't want to hire unbelievers by forcing them to and suing them if they don't. But you couldn't discriminate against, the black person or whatever because he's black, and so we give him his rights. Or the woman, because she's a woman, we give her her rights. And what about the Christian? I mean, he's a person, an individual who has his rights. Well, some areas no. Because, you see, in that regard, his rights violate someone else's rights. The right to work wherever you want, you see, has been violated by the right of the Christian to not hire people who are unbelievers. See, people, this business of rights, you're always going to be running against someone somewhere sooner or later. And it's up to the ones who frame and who make the laws and fuel government to tell us which rights are allowed to be heard and practiced. The others are squished, denied. They're forced out. But on the subject of the poor, Galatians chapter 2 and verse 10, Paul writes and said, only they would, he's talking about some of the apostles at Jerusalem, they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. All right? And then if you turn over to Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 15, here you have in one chapter a rather remarkable statement. In the first few verses here, like in verse 6, Deuteronomy 15, God tells the nation of Israel that he's going to bless them, the nation of Israel. And a nation isn't just nation. A nation is made up of people. So that means he's going to bless each and every person. He's going to bless the people. So much so that they would lend unto many nations. They would not borrow. Thou shalt reign over many nations, and they shall not reign over thee. Well, let's go back to the lending and borrowing. In other words, they're going not to be poor. They're going to have so much they have enough to give to others. Same chapter, verse 7, next verse. If there be among you a poor man of thy brethren. Verse 11 sets it all up for us. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. It almost seems like you have a contradiction on your hands. God said he'd bless the whole nation. The whole nation. Nation's not like N-A-T-I-O-N. It's made up of people. People make up a nation. He'd bless them. He'd bless them so much that they would have enough to lend or to give to others, and they would never have to borrow. And yet, when we get down to verse 11, now the promise is not being given. Reality is being set forth and stated. The poor shall never cease out of the land. Even God himself had given the nation of Israel this promise, and yet God is too wise to be fooled with this delusion that all men are created equal. All men are not created equal. All men don't respond to life or to anything the same way. Different men respond different ways. Although God had given them a promise, it was a promise that was dependent on each and every person to meet the requirements and do his will and obey him, and he knew that they wouldn't. And so at the end he has to state what is the reality in Israel. The poor will never cease out of your land. And then one third occasion, we don't need to look it up, but over in the Gospels, whenever a lot of expense was poured on Jesus, wasted, some of the apostles said on him. One of the apostles said, well, why was this not rather sold and the money given to the poor? And Jesus' response was this, the poor you will always have with you, but not me. So do what you need to do to me now. The poor you will always have with you. In other words, our government has this delusion in its mind that we can somehow cure ourselves of poverty. You do it because you have this basic fundamental belief that we are created equal, and secondly, that the government is, as the great equalizer, the best dispenser for these things. Well, let's come over into the realm of public education. Public education is actually an instrument of government policy. How does the government affect us? Well, through laws, yes. But all governments have recognized sooner or later that the best way to get to your people is to take them through a system of indoctrination. Public education is actually an instrument of government policy. It's like an employee of the federal government, which means that public education is bound by duty to reflect and teach whatever concept or ideology is current in the government at that time. It's an employee of the government. It functions for the government. It works for the government. It is the channel of government policy. Let me give you a few examples of this. We go back to the days when the Soviets launched their first rocket into space, and they beat the Americans. Sputnik was its name, I believe. Amen. Now, the government immediately starts doing studies and surveys, and you read the Attorney General's report on this or the Attorney General's report on that, and you have these surveys and studies and reports drawn up, or a congressional committee. And the government is very concerned about being outdistanced in space by the Soviet Union. The government's got to find a way to check that. Well, it's almost too late, and so they figure out a way. What they're going to do is increase the math and science teachings down in the elementary and junior high level. Now, that's only going to be good for a few years from now, but at least we've got to start on it. How does government policy get into motion? How does it set in effect here? Through the school system, through the public school system. And it was due to that little episode that we have had, and it's never really ceased since then, this incredible emphasis on a lot of abstract mathematics and science, because you have to know that to send rockets to outer space. And you don't get to send rockets to outer space by working in home ec or shop or English lit or something. You've got to have this advanced ability in mathematics and science. And I think that all of us who are parents now with children, we remember back in the good old days, however far those good old days were ago, what math and science were like. Every year they're worse. They're harder, in other words. Every year they're more and more difficult. Back in the good old days, there were some elementary things to learn about adding and subtracting, and maybe some things about, planes or something in geometry, and that's all fine and well. Then it gets into advanced calculations, where the average person never has need of that for as long as he lives. Amen. And he won't remember it beyond the test. That's guaranteed. Why waste the time? You're wasting government employees, government money, government time, government institutions, government building, government heating. Supplied by taxpayers, of course, as well as the federal government itself, but even that then is supplied by taxpayers. They get all their money from us. Whether we're taxed locally here in a direct sense or we're taxed indirectly, that goes to the government, that comes back as a $21 trillion public education federal government school budget's another matter. But it comes back, $21 trillion for public education. It's just incredible what the government spends in so many different ways. You probably didn't know that. We'll get into that some other time. But there's one way that the public school system can be shown as an instrument of federal government policy. Or let's take another matter. Sex education. Now, I don't think that we had that back when I never took it. So that's how knowledgeable I was. I never had sex education in school. Sex education in school? You just don't teach sex in school. That's right. But between that time and this time, you do teach sex education in school. Now, it was taught in college back in those days, but not in high school. We never had it. Not in high school. Not in junior high school. Not in elementary school. Not sex education. I never even knew there was such a thing as sex education. Sex education, do you hear? It's all a part of public education. Now, the government happens at this time to have an extra little elf to help it along, because some people, even some non-Christian but morally professing Americans out there, are opposed to sex education in the school system. But now they have something to help them. And notice how the government's getting involved in here, and that's finding a cure for this disease called AIDS. And you watch and see what the government's going to do. They're going to use it. They already have. They're going to use that little scare tactic, and it is a scare tactic, and it is something to be scared of for the people out there. It's going to use that as another little help, or another little elf, another little supporting cause to further sex education in school. And you see, now you go beyond, because of what AIDS is all about, you go beyond discussing normal sexuality. You don't catch AIDS by normal sexuality. You catch it by perversions of the worst sort. So if you're going to teach the children about AIDS, what do you have to teach them about? Sodomy, bestiality, perversion, homosexuality, lesbianism. That's exactly where all that leads in. And the government, you see, uses these things and it just indoctrinates its people through the public school system. Something else that came up not that many years ago, back in the 60s, some Americans began to really go on a health binge. That's when it all got started, with food and exercise and all of this. Some of that's good, some of it's not good. But they really went on a health binge. If you did a little study, some of you have read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. If you haven't read, you ought to read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It's eye-opening. You think that our government is, basically good. It's the greatest equalizer. It's the one that is benevolent, that dispenses these things in society. You'd be shocked to see the government doesn't want to do anything unless it has to do things. And back in those days, you could buy, if you read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, it turns your stomach. What food used to be made of back then, the government allowed all of that. That took that book, that one book in Chicago, caused an uproar. And that led to the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration, so that you got this USDA stamp on meats and things. You didn't have that back in those days. You didn't know what you were buying. The government let all of that stuff go. And, let's face it, most people, because they are sons of Satan and Adam, they don't want to give you their best cattle or their best whatever. They're going to grind up a lot of filth and trash in that to make it go further, spread out more to make more money. That's exactly what they were feeding. People eating the worst stuff you can imagine. And Sinclair, who was a social critic and who was a socialist, communist himself by the end of his life, which we're not commenting on Upton Sinclair's life, but that book had a profound effect. So people back in the 60s, they knew that the government's not concerned about us unless we force them to be concerned. People got real uptight over foods, what we're going into foods. I guess I'm saying that because I think the average person's conception would be all this business of junky food, that's just been recent in the 1970s or something. That goes back to the beginning. Unscrupulous merchants and suppliers and producers, when the government didn't have any control of them, would sell you anything. And hopefully the worse, the less it costs them, the more that goes into their pocket. And when you're selling some nice food, that's really nice food, it's going to cost you some money then. So this isn't this junk food business, something that goes back to just the 70s. That goes back to olden times. But anyway, people got concerned. And so I can remember going to school back in the good old days, walking to elementary school with my little lunch box, and some days when I didn't take my lunch and I'd get me a little school lunch there. I can remember the little cartons of milk. They were like, I think, 2 cents for a carton of milk, and the little old burgers or whatever you would buy there. People got real concerned about nutrition as a whole. You see, that was spreading. That was a grassroots movement. Then what happened? The government stepped in and then forced nutrition in school programs in. And now when you go to school, if you're going to a school that's obeying the regulations, you're supposed to be getting good food there. It may be a soybean burger, but they tell us soybean's better than hamburger anyway. You're getting the vitamins, you're getting the nutrients you're supposed to get. You don't get junk, and you're not supposed to anyway. You're getting food that is quality food that has nutritional value to it. Why? Public education, the school system, is an instrument of government policy. The government descends on the school system and disseminates these ideas and notions and these practices through the public school system. Now let's come to one final one, the one I really want to spend a little time on. A few years ago, the end of the 50s, into the 60s, early 70s, the big issue, the really big issue, was desegregation, integration of the races. Now the liberal social high priest in government worked through the courts to use the public schools as instruments of forcing social change on the American scene. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the costly, confusing, insane practice called busing. federal judges all across this land handed down the law that came from Mount Sinai, that equals the Supreme Court, and forced a mass movement and relocation of children all over the town, all in the name of, back to our fundamental principle, all men are created equal. That is a myth as long as a summer day is. It's an unreality. You'll never affect it. You'll never experience it. We are not all created equal. This is not an equal world. We don't get equal. Nothing is equal. Nothing is fair in this world. And the only way you ever learn that is when you get converted. And you find out nothing is fair. Nothing is based on fairness or justice. And the worst thing you could try to do is force things on the basis of fairness and justice. You're perverting the whole order that the world functions by right now. In other words, you're trying to bring a utopia. That's exactly what the social engineers who work from the government are trying to do, bring a utopia, a Christ-less millennium on the earth right now through government policy, public education, and the whole American dream of the melting pot. Now, I remember back in those days, I was in the public school system then, and I am from the South, and I can tell you stories, friends. I can tell you stories. You can read books yourself on what was going on. All in the name of fairness and justice, all in the name of American democracy, which is the strangest, most hideous beast you could ever hope to find. It's an impossible dream. Democracy is an impossible dream. It never will work, never has worked, can't work. It's impossible. Created equal government as the greatest equalizer and dispenser of goodness and benevolence. That's a false myth. I was raised in a neighborhood, White Haven, southern neighborhood in Memphis. Time magazine just had an article about White Haven, Memphis, Tennessee the other day. That was interesting because that's the southernmost suburb of the city of Memphis in Tennessee, in White Haven. They called it white because that's where white people lived. We didn't have any blacks there. Not back in the good old days. Now, whether blacks, it doesn't make any difference from a Christian point of view. I'm trying to talk from the government's point of view and reality's point of view out there. We can function a certain way with ourselves as believers, where we can look at other men and see them as potential recipients of God's salvation. But this business of all men created equal, that's a myth. The facts of reality tell you that, friends. You see, the social engineers have wanted to tell us men are created equal. What makes the problem, the difference in people's lives, is their environment as they grow up. That's not true. That only is part of the answer to it. But all human beings are different anyway. And of course, it's ruling out the fact that there is a struggle going on in the world between forces called God and Satan. Completely denies that, overlooks that. And we have this left-wing, bleeding heart, liberal sentimentalism that always comes from those people of let's be fair to everyone. But I grew up in a neighborhood where we walked to school. And it wasn't like in the good old days of country schools where you walked like 5 or 6 or 7 miles to school and you walked back. It wasn't that far. It was like 2 or 3 blocks. Walk to school. I had been there grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. My older sister went there 1 through 12. And that was kind of the thing in the neighborhood. This is our school here. Fairleigh School belongs to White Haven. This is our school. All the people in the environment, in the surrounding environment there, they get to go to the school here. Well, it came time for the 7th grade. We were just hitting, the late 60s and early 70s now. And the rage of the country was integration of the races and desegregation. We had, I think, maybe a couple of black people in the school. As a matter of fact, the friends that I had, one of my closest friends was black. So that shows that I wasn't opposed, on any personal basis to black people. If, as far as I was concerned, if you're a good friend, it doesn't make any difference whether you're black or white. I was colorblind in that sense then. But a whole lot of other people weren't. Neither the blacks nor the whites. Don't you believe this notion that the whites are the ones that are colorblind in the sense that, the blacks rather are the ones that are colorblind. The whites are as well. The blacks, in other words, see themselves as being very important, and they don't like the whites. They can't just throw that at the white people. So there came a day, believe it or not, and it just caused no end of problems. All you've got to do is read a book like The Forced Busing in Boston. You're too far north now to force bust. Down south, that's one thing. The whites hold control down there anyway. Boston? Boston? I've read a book on it. It's horrible what they experience there. Boston? You don't bus in Boston. Maybe Chicago, because Gary is not far from there. Boston? You don't bus in Boston. Montgomery, Alabama? Yes. Jacksonville, Florida? Yes. Baton Rouge, Louisiana? Memphis? Jackson, Mississippi? Yes. Atlanta, Georgia? Yes. Little Rock, Arkansas? They tried that? Yes. No, they said, but yes. You get any above, the Mason-Dixon line? No. And it barely worked. Well, it really didn't. It never has worked. But I went to school come the 7th grade and find out I don't get to go to my school anymore. Why? Racial prejudice. That I have? No. That someone has toward me. You talk about integration of the races and desegregation, and they were forced to discriminate against us based on the color of our skin. You see, you're going to have discrimination anyway you go. I was discriminated against because I was a white boy and I was not allowed to go to my own local neighborhood school. Do you see, that's discrimination in reverse there. You simply replace one form of discrimination for another. Now we've gone from discrimination against the blacks to discrimination against the whites. I mean, it was a lot harder. I had to get up like 45 minutes earlier because you can't just run to school. I can run to school and be there in no time. You've got to get up, get dressed, a cold winter morning, eat your breakfast, go stand in line. You had to go to school to do it. The buses didn't come by your house. You still had to walk to school. Then you walk to school, then the buses break down, and these weren't like yellow school buses. These were big Greyhound buses. They had commandeered those from the city of Memphis. They had taken them over to use them for forced public busing there. We never rode on a school bus. We rode on these big, huge things with the air conditioners and everything on them. They commandeered those and took them away from the city, gave them to the school system. Government policy being enforced through public education. So I get there early at school. It's still dark in the morning and you stand outside. You're not allowed to go in. That's not your school anymore. Black people took that over. You're just taking white people from their neighborhood and putting them in blacks' neighborhood and taking the blacks and putting them in whites. That is insane. That is absurd. That is discrimination of the worst sort. You're not only discriminating against the whites, it's a double take of discrimination against the blacks now. You took them out of their own neighborhood, their own environment. I know that their schools maybe weren't up to par with the white people's. And you put them in schools where because they weren't up to par, they can't cope, they can't finish, they can't do it. Well, I know the argument is, well, it takes a lot of time. Well, yeah, it does, but won't time work everything out for people? They always say that, well, it'll take a lot of time. If you'll do this enough for enough years and go through enough generations, well, then you're going to have ignorant white people and intelligent black people. So you're going to do the whole process over again. It's all insane. You say, what is the alternative? There is no alternative. But just do nothing. You didn't help the matter any, not one iota. You hurt things. You cost a lot of money to taxpayers. Those buses had to be paid for. Those drivers had to be paid. The gas bill had to be paid. That's all addition. That's extra beyond what you're going to pay to keep the schools open themselves. So we stand out there for a half hour shivering in the cold waiting for these buses, and then here they come. And I'll never forget these thoughts as long as I live. You're just a little child. 7th grade, you're pretty young. And I can remember that so clearly. Here comes just a string of them. I mean, it reminds you of some foreign totalitarian government. In America, you ought to be able to go to school where you want to go to school. It's a free land, a free country. And here come all these meat wagons down there, one after another, big old buses. And here are all these little innocent white children, most of us who had already made friends with black people who happened to be in our school. We had a few there. So it wasn't our problem. It was for an older generation, and we were being forced to suffer for all of that. Amen. So we stood out there and got on our little bus, and the bus took us all the way through, across Whitehaven, across town, over to the airport. And we went to Winchester, which was that wasn't even that was another white neighborhood. They took us from one white neighborhood to another white neighborhood, and then took black people into that white neighborhood. Why they didn't just bring them to mine and leave us alone, I don't know. And I remember singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall. That's how we got to school every morning. I've got such a vivid memory of that. It'd be cold outside. We'd be back there singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall. Take one down, pass it around, 98 bottles of beer on the wall. Don't teach your child that one now. And then, you go all the way down to 1, and when you're not there, you start over again. And did it cause problems. And then you took us in, you see, to an environment and bust black people in there, and the blacks and the whites were being, you see, this is what I'm saying is it was government enforced policy. The people, the general average people, they didn't even want it. There were some big wig, big mouth, white and black people that were demanding it, like Martin Luther King Jr., who had gotten this whole thing going, and Malcolm X, who were stirring up the people. The black people didn't want this. I talked to enough, and they didn't want it any more than we wanted it. They didn't get any better education, and we probably got a worse education by being forced out of our... It only lasted, I think, for 6 months myself. And then my parents took me out of the public school system, put me in a private school. I wasn't learning anything. You put us in a black environment where we weren't raised that way. They speak a different language. They have a different culture. They're different people. We don't mix with them. And what happens? You have fights. You have fights, murders, rapes, all the time. We wouldn't have had that severe of a problem if they had left us back where we were in the first place. So what I'm saying is, you talk about being created equal. Well, the public school system was forced to treat us as though we weren't equal, forced to discriminate against us on the basis of our color, all in order to eliminate racial prejudice. I mean, the irony of it all. They were forced to discriminate on the basis of our color in order to eliminate racial prejudice. I think you're just talking nonsense. You said the same thing then. You're forced not to discriminate so that you can discriminate. That's exactly what happened. You're forced not to discriminate so you can discriminate. You're forced to desegregate so you can segregate so that you can desegregate. And if you really carried it to its logical end and got all the black people there and took us and gave us the old rundown schools, in the inner city, gave us the slum areas, and maybe even made us move there. This government of ours is so perverted with this zeal they have for all men are equal, all men are equal, all men are equal. I mean, that's back in our Constitution, all men are equal. That what you're going to have is a bunch of slave, ignoramus white people then. And the blacks will take over us, and slavery will start all over again, and they'll start growing tobacco again on the big plantations, and we're going to have, Harriet Beecher Stowe come along again and write an Uncle Tom's Cabin or whatever and set the white people free this time. In other words, what I'm saying is education is such a mess that there's no way that education is going to be, or the government is going to be able to solve these problems. And yet they're bound and determined to solve these problems by forcing government policy on the public school system. Well, let me go on this morning to give you some more descriptions then of what the public school is all about and like. We're talking about public education. We're going to be looking some at its history and some of its obvious failures. So what is it that we're talking about? What is public education? Well, this writer says that the best way to describe public education is to tell us what the school is all about. First, then, there's the physical existence, which is visible to all of us across the American landscape. The public school, especially the American high school, with its spacious lawns and playing fields, is a quasi-sacred landmark in every American town. As indelibly part of the community government as the town hall, the fire station, the police station, the courthouse, and the public library. But the public school represents something more than merely a government service or the enforcement of law. It represents a body of intellectual, moral, and philosophical values based on the concepts that created it and expressed in the activities that go on within its walls. Listen to this statement. The youngster who passes through its classrooms emerges indoctrinated in a body of secular values, as if he had gone to some sort of government parochial school, which is just another good name for the public school. It's a government private school. It's a government parochial religious school where you're taught religious secular humanism as your form of belief. It may not be a very coherent body of values, and it may conflict with the values of his parents or religion, but that very incoherence and conflict combined with a general philosophical confusion, becomes the dominant frame of mind of the graduate. He writes, thus the school building itself seems to have its own spiritual aura as palpable as that of any church with its peculiarly spiritual architecture. The textbook, with its litany of questions and topics for discussion, takes the place of the prayer book, dispensing moral as well as instructional information. And we can just go on making the parallels between that and what they think of as religious. The local teacher, your teacher over you, is your pastor. The guidance counselor is your priest to whom you confess. The assistant principal is a cardinal, on the rank of a cardinal. The principal, oh, he's the pope in the school. Everyone in the school fears the principal. The first day of school or the first day returning to school is like confirmation or baptism. It is an initiation rite that you go through as an American citizen. You've got to use your imagination and go back to the days when you went. I remember that. The first day of school was like, it was an incredible experience that I had on the inside of me. It wasn't just going to school like you go to work or something. There was a meaning to it, a feeling to it. Going back to school or going to school the first day is like confirmation or baptism. It's a whole religious experience that people go through. And then let's think about all of the great past football leaders and football players. You generally have a trophy case out front with the trophies that belong. Well, those are the dead saints, the martyrs of the faith, who've come before. You can find a parallel. These are coming to mind. He doesn't have any of these. You can find a parallel for probably just about everything. You have it all there, because it includes with it a very real feeling that you experience as you go. And I don't know, you could compare then, homecoming or night football games where, you're getting 8th grade, 9th grade, and you get to hold your girlfriend's hand, or maybe younger than that today, and go to a night football game, and had a lot of meaning and purpose, and people look forward to that. You get to sit in the bleachers in the stands, sit close to your girlfriend or your boyfriend, and watch old hometown USA here defeat those communist rivals. It was always a communist. If it wasn't you, you were the best, the greatest. And so if it was like our opponents were Whitehaven High School and Bishop Burn and Hillcrest, those were like communists, Japanese. This is fairly high. This is our high school here. And you had to defeat all of these invaders into your home territory and soil here. You probably get some military parallels and figures out of it as well. This is particularly true of the social sciences, where a secular humanist view of the world is presented virtually as revealed religion, based on an unquestioned faith in science and materialism. Thus, the rituals of school life replace the rituals of the church to fill the youngster's day with a formalism called, quote, education, unquote. No one is sure what it all means, for there is in America as much confusion and vagueness surrounding the word education as there is surrounding the word religion. Then he goes from the school building itself, its physical existence, to, secondly, and take the physical plant, which also represents a considerable public investment and indebtedness. Big schools have their own physical plant there. Like I remember the latest experience I had was down in seminary. You've got to have your own sewage treatment and everything there, even though you're in town. It's so big with so many people there, they have their own physical plant with their generators and everything. Well, if you don't have all that, you got your big boilers and your boiler room and your typical American public high school. So the, quote, physical plant, he said, is a huge investment and indebtedness. He writes, there are 70,000 elementary schools and 24,000 high schools in America, representing substantial community investments in real property and equipment, all financed by the taxpayer. Maintenance of this property. Don't you remember that old bald fellow that had that big ring of keys in your school? Probably several of them. The custodians that worked down in the boiler room. I never figured out how he could find the key on that thing. There must have been 100 of them there. He had a key for every lock everywhere. See, there's an experience that you have. That was a certain man there. What would he be like? I guess like the laity, like an altar boy or something in your typical church. Because he had control of things and he ran the errands, but he wasn't one of the high-ups. Maintenance of this property is a perpetual burden on each community, which is, however, periodically reassured by the educators that the burden is well worth bearing. Taxation for the local schools tends to fortify the thought that the community not only controls the school property, but also what goes on within its buildings. But the truth is that the neighborhood school is controlled by a national educational and bureaucratic hierarchy completely insulated from local community pressures and answerable only to itself. One of the myths earlier was that they're answerable through an elected school board to the public. That's not true. That's not true. It sounds good. You may think that you know some occasions where that is true. That isn't true, though. They are answerable only to themselves. Curriculum is determined by remote educational commissions in far-off universities, while national school policies are determined by federal judges and the dispensers of federal funds, without which more and more public schools cannot get along. You see how intricately tied in it is with the American federal government. Whatever the government stands for, the school system has to stand for. Then public education is also an employer in every town and city in the nation. There are over 2 million teachers and administrators for whom public education is a primary source of livelihood. To them, the public school is a place for building careers and professional reputations, with the students merely passing through and the townspeople picking up the tab. It's not as though, they're doing something to earn something. They like what they're involved in there. I guess on one hand we could say that teaching children would be something rather difficult, but on another hand, that's rather easy. And some teachers, are a lot worse than others. You didn't ever learn anything from them. They give you some questions out of a book and read the material. You could have read that on your own. They talk to you a little bit about it, and then they dismiss you. And then where do they go? To the teacher's lounge to smoke a cigarette and drink a pop and joke with all their friends in there. And then, I've got to go back. See, I taught school for a while. I know what goes on in the teacher's lounge. Because I was allowed in there. I was teaching only part-time then, but I went. And you go in the teacher's lounge, and no one is excited about what they're doing. Whenever the bell would ring or whenever they'd look at their watch, they would all go, oh, no, we got to go through this again. Let's get it over with. Without exception, they were doing that. And yet they show up with a little smiley, cheery face in the room. Well, they've got to. They're paid to do that. They're paid to look that way. What's a used car salesman look like? But he's paid to look and to act a certain way. Well, I know what goes on in the teachers' lounges. They complain, and they're bitter, and they're resenting everything. But it's relatively easy for them. Spout off a few things from a textbook and go sit in the lounge for 15 minutes. Then go to another class and go sit in the lounge. And then get to sponsor the cheerleaders and sponsor, the pep rally and the football players and do all of this. That's fun. And get paid. Not have to work. Get paid to do all of that. After you've been a teacher, teachers teach generally 1 or 2 topics, same grade. After you've been one for a year or two, you've got all the material memorized. You really do. You've got all that material memorized. That's easy. Think of that for a job. That'd be a wonderful job. And who's picking it up? It's not as though you're getting really paid by someone who employs you. You're not getting paid. It's something, it's unusual. The tab is picked up by the community. Teachers and administrators are on the receiving end of a vast local and government payroll. For them, public education is an economic lifeline that determines their standard of living and their status in the community. Public education is therefore money. Apart from national defense, public education now represents the largest single tax-based system of cash flow in the whole United States. Second only to defense. Those expenses related to keeping the military up and going is public education. He gives figures that are more than 10 years old here, $81 billion. That was way back in the 70s, $81 billion. $81 billion. Now, what is it? Someone has said, if you put $1 billion bills end to end, they go to the moon and back? To the moon and back. $1 billion $1 bills? Here's $81 billion. more recent figures are 21 trillion. More than 2 million educators have developed a vested interest in seeing that the cash not only continues to flow, but increases in volume. It is far easier to increase the flow of cash in an established and accepted public channel than to create an entirely new flow of cash, public or private. So he gives some statistics, and I'm not going to read all those, but here he summed them up. Here's his conclusion after a long list of statistics. For some reason, he goes from the years 1970 to 77 and shows how there are many fewer, 5.5 million, fewer students. There are 5.5 million fewer students, and yet it requires 135,000 more teachers and $36 more billion. You know, the school population decreased, but the need for teachers and money increased. Isn't that government for you? Always paying more and getting less. The longer you go, you always are paying more and getting less. Right. 5.5 million fewer students required some 135,000 more teachers and $36 billion more dollars. Then finally he ends with this note: public education is also a complex legal structure that not only requires communities to build and operate schools, but also places severe limits on the freedom of parents to educate their children according to their own wishes. Almost every state in the Union has a compulsory attendance law requiring parents to send their children to the government schools, or of course to a private school or homeschooling, but it's still mandatory attendance. You can't just say, oh, I'm not going to do it. It's mandatory by law. Sending them to the government schools or private schools or some other alternative, as long as they meet the requirements set by law. How true that is. I mean, there's a mandatory attendance, compulsory attendance here in this state. You don't have to go to a public school, but you have to be educated. And the way you're educated must meet what the state is looking for. It must do that. And some are so strict in that area, you cannot teach your children at home. As far as I know, there's only one state in the Union that does not have a compulsory attendance law, and that was a couple of years ago. I don't know if that's changed since then or not. But all the other states have compulsory attendance laws. And truancy laws are some of the biggest ones you can break. You get in all types of trouble. Back in the good old days, if you were like Tom Sawyer and Mark Twain, Huck Finn, you want to go fishing and tie a rope to your big toe and float on a raft down the Mississippi, you just went. They came after you even in those days, but you had ways to escape. Now it's not like a federal offense. It's like treason to the government. That you took your child isn't in school. It's like treason now. It's like a federal offense. Back in the good old days, it was just, well, the people, even the truant officers who came out knew, I know why they're not. Who wants to go to school when you can fish or sunbathe, you know? Now they don't kind of have that laid-back attitude to it anymore. You've got to get them in the system, because only in the system will they learn what the system is all about. And we don't want a lot of people running around in this country who haven't been indoctrinated. They're going to start an uprising here. They're going to overthrow something sooner or later. And that's why you better believe they are opposed to this homeschooling movement. So I want to end our study this morning with this statement. We've been talking in two parts now about the conspiracy of American public education. It is a conspiracy that regardless of the motive or the state of consciousness, it has the same end, which is the systematic destruction of biblical Christianity, traditional morality, the pro-life, pro-family, truth value system. They're totally opposed to that. Whether or not, I said, it doesn't matter exactly what their state of consciousness is or their motive in doing it. I said it has the same basic end. The destruction of everything that we know to be Christian, traditional, old-fashioned, standard, pro-life, pro-family, whatever, pro-truth beliefs. They're opposed to all of that. Regardless of the state of consciousness, that is what they are coming against. It is a conspiracy. It's held in a high state of consciousness more in some people's minds than others. And we've discussed that before, so I hope I don't have to keep saying that. We can all remember teachers or find teachers that are really there for the good of the students, who love what they're doing, who go to church on the side and blah, blah, blah. They're a standard Christian public educator. But those are becoming less and less. Those are in the minority today. In the good old days, they were in the majority. Because the one to whom you trusted your children was a very important man in the local village. And he either was the parson or the parson's friend. You didn't just entrust your children to any fool or anyone you didn't know anything about in the community. You knew the local schoolmaster. And he was a moral man, generally a Christian man, and you entrusted your children to his tutelage and to his upbringing for their education. And of course today, you see, because of our whole society, we've not only lost that, we've lost the ability to ever have that recreated. You go to these huge mammoth schools where some of them, well, almost outdo in student population some small colleges, where there are hundreds and hundreds, maybe 1,000, maybe a couple of thousand students there. That's larger than a lot of colleges and universities. Children running everywhere, and who knows who educating whom, saying what, no one knows.